Hello, everyone. My name is Mila Alayubi. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships for BISC, and my pronouns are she, her. I oversee our research program and oversaw this pre and post-election research project. The purpose of this project was to build off of our 2018 pre and post-election work, taking a deeper look at voter motivation and behavior and ballot measure perceptions of Black, Latinx, Native American, AAPI, and Gen Z voters. We also explored the interplay between candidates and ballot measure messaging, and structural reforms that communities of color and young voters want to see realized via direct democracy. The research project was done in 4 phases: a pre-election online survey of 11 roadmap states, followed by an online focus group and qual boards, and a post-election survey. We use this research to inform our work, but it also serves as a tool for our state partners, our national partners, and funders to assess how they approach ballot measure work as well, to move bolder structural reforms through the 360 ballot measure lifecycle. I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you to HIT Strategies and Lake Research Partners, who were incredible to work with and did amazing work. And our panelists today, Licia and Joseph, were one of a number of partners that served on the Research and Narrative Committee for this project. It's important to BISC that partners not only have access to the research that we hope supports them in their work, but that they are also part of the design process for the research, giving us valuable insight and input along the way. We are so grateful to Licia and Joseph and all the partners that engaged with us on this project. So the first question I'd like to pose today is, what is it that actually interested both of you in being part of this project? And what are some of the important considerations we need to take into account when researching American Indian, Alaska Native communities, as well as AAPI communities? Licia, would you like to start?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mila, for having me. Kamadum Venti, Miem Licia Maddox, citizen of the Quetzal Indian Nation and current Deputy Director at the California Native Vote Project. I took part in this effort in my role as the Vice President of External Affairs at the National Congress of American Indians. So as many of you may or may not know, many American Indian and Alaska Native people went into 2020 knowing that it would be one of the biggest years for civic engagement in Indian country. And similar to other social movements, Native people stand ready to be seen and heard. So backing this up with the data, the recent survey showed us that 8 in 10 Native voters were motivated to vote in the 2020 elections. But like other voting groups, there was frustration and anxiety. But despite these sentiments, many Native people who participated in these surveys expressed true interest in the 2020 election. In my role at the National Congress of American Indians, we learned that much of these feelings came from needing more information about the candidates, ballot initiatives, and even more important, more information about access to the polls. These are some of the most important reasons that we participated in this process.
Thank you, Licia. Joseph.
My name's Joseph. I use he, him as pronouns, and I'm the policy analyst at Asian Counseling and Referral Service. And we're based in Seattle, Washington, serving the kind of greater Seattle and King County area. And we provide direct services to over 30,000 clients a year in 40 plus languages. And I think that actually helps start to address some of the reasons that it's so important to be engaging our communities in terms of how they're involved in ballot initiatives and voting in general. For ACRS, we've been involved in multiple ballot initiatives that have affected our community members. Really wanted to see important data just showing how our communities are not only engaged in terms of ballot issues, but also how they feel that they're able to participate in process, and really wanting to also emphasize the need for data disaggregation, considering that the communities that we work with, as I mentioned before, 40 plus languages and dialects are consistently represented at ACRS among our staff and clients, and just showing how all the different ways that our communities are impacted. It's so different across our communities.
So this next question I'd like to ask Licia. Across a whole plethora of issues, Native Americans were more likely to want to pass those issues by ballot measures rather than relying on legislatures or candidates. Why do you think that is?
Thank you for that question. It's super important. So I think the basic answer is that representation matters. And although we're seeing more and more Native people running for office, we still do not have the representation needed to support the issues and the matters that matter most to our communities. So in this survey, we saw that Native people were concerned about jobs, the economy, healthcare, racism, and justice. That's just to name a few. And we know that these concerns directly coincide with the effects that COVID-19 has had on American Indian and Alaska Native communities.
And a follow-up question to that, when you first spoke about some of the issues that were really important to Native Americans, and you lifted up discrimination and racism in America. And so the Native Americans in the focus groups were also, along with Black voters in the focus groups, the most likely to prefer a message about ballot measures that talked about them as a way to combat structural racism. And their top issues in the post-election survey focused on structural reforms related to our democracy and restructuring of prisons and police. Have you seen these types of issues or messages resonate in other Native American research?
Thank you for that question. So similar to our Black counterparts, Native American people are more likely to experience the school to prison pipeline. And, we're trying to combat those types of structures by creating educational systems that are not only inclusive of Native curriculum, but justice systems that are also inclusive of Native people's traditional methods of restorative justice. Native people continue to be marginalized. And if we look at the data, we see that just in the 2010 census data, Native people were undercounted at 4.9%, and that was nearly double the next population group. So when we're missing from the data, it means that we're also missing from the legal aspect of it, the policy aspect of it. And right now we're really encouraged because the new administration that just took office is showing us that they are committed to tribal consultation and really addressing the needs of Native people, which means that they're also willing to go back and look at these systems that were not created for us and figure out what they can do to make sure that we have representation, we have a voice at the table, and that we're working in a system that works for all of us. That is true democracy.
So I'd like to ask Joseph a question here. The AAPI voters in the pre-election survey were not quite as motivated to vote. They were at 69% as the Native American, Latinx, and Black voters that we surveyed. What were some of the factors that you think contributed to that?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I really appreciate bringing up just some of the disparities that you see in the data. And one of the kind of experiences that I've had working with a lot of AAPI voters, first of all, it's just the incredible diversity across the communities. It's actually speaking to the need for really good disaggregation of the data, because the issues that motivate various Asian and Pacific Islander community members to vote vary so much across the community. So it can be really tough sometimes to feel motivated, sometimes in a system, I think, that hasn't really demonstrated that it cares for us. And on a more basic level too, there's also the language access issue, because we're lucky in King County that we have our ballots and voter guide information in not just English and Spanish, but also Korean, Vietnamese, and Chinese. But again, there are just so many community members who feel left out. Like, the information isn't really there for them. The campaigns don't contact them as much, in language. So it's sort of a chicken and the egg cycle where a lot of times campaigns, ballot initiative, and individuals don't reach out to our community members as much because they think that they're not sort of worth reaching out to. But then that sort of creates that vicious cycle where our community members feel sort of disenfranchised by that and don't engage as much.
We also saw, Joseph, that AAPI voters also had the highest vote by mail utilization rate at 63 pre-election, and 74% reported they had used VBM in the post-election survey, with 70% saying they plan to vote by mail next time. What were some of the reasons you think vote by mail appealed and appeals to AAPI voters?
In terms of why a lot of our community members, I think, really embraced the vote by mail system, there are a few factors that I can immediately think of. And one thing I'd like to mention is just that I think our communities actually do have quite a bit of confidence in the vote by mail system. And at least in my experience in Washington State, we are very lucky to have a very, very robust vote by mail system that's been going since long before the pandemic. And we've been able to work for years with our community members to make sure that they understand how to use that system, to make sure that they're getting a ballot in whatever language they would prefer if it's available. We also have a very high proportion of elderly folks, in our communities, and voting by mail is a great option for them. I have to admit that because of the current circumstances, because of the previous administration's use of a lot of very unnecessarily racialized terms regarding the coronavirus, it's made a lot of our community members also, though, feel not as safe going outside. And I think there is also an attractiveness of voting by mail when it makes it less likely that you'll have to sort of put yourself out there. And I think a lot of our elderly community members in particular, feel much safer when they're able to, use vote by mail, for example. So many different factors there, but I think that's kind of what it boils down to.
Hey, Mila, do you mind if I chime in on vote by mail?
Oh, please do.
So I definitely wanted to make sure that, from a voter equity standpoint, that we really did try to make sure to shed some light on the fact that, while this method of casting a ballot works for most voters, rural Native populations don't have the same types of access to vote by mail as other populations. So the positive side of what we saw in this research is that Native people came out to the 2020 election feeling hopeful. And despite all the challenges with vote by mail, they still felt positive that their ballot was secure using that method.
So this is exactly why we have a research and narrative committee, because of insights like this that we need to have in order to better inform our research that we do now and in the future. But before we end, I'd really like to take a moment to just highlight the key takeaways that we found from this research that's going to inform our long-term strategy over the next 10 years. We identified that there are 3 areas where people of color and young people really want to invest in long-term. The first is around democracy and protecting it and unleashing it. Really wanting to push forward the idea of universal voting, no barriers, no restrictions. The second idea is around economic justice, increasing access to healthcare, education, housing, and income, and expanding benefits like paid family leave for all. And really in the long term, making sure that folks have things like basic universal income so that they can really live their best life and have their basic needs provided for. And the third piece is around restorative justice and dismantling the systems that perpetuate slavery in America, and being able to do this through decriminalization of drugs and sex work and sentencing reform, and really dismantling the ways that we detain people, and really moving towards a country where there is no profit from prisons and from detention centers. And we're going to do this in a variety of ways. We're going to dive deeper in learning more about the communities that are hardest hit by these issues. And we're going to take all of this data around unleashing democracy, around economic justice, and around restorative justice, and it's going to be the bedrock of our 2021 and 2022 research program.